Welcome to our second discussion on middle adulthood. This next slide is really just a reminder. We've talked about this already, but remember that middle adulthood generally refers to ages 40 to 65 in psychology, and we are focused on that Erickson's stage, the conflict of generativity versus stagnation. So that feeling of I'm moving forward, I'm creating opportunities for myself, I'm creating security for my family. I'm not just kind of staying in one place versus that stagnation, not moving forward, not growing. I wanted to share a couple of songs with you just because I think that a lot of times when we think about life and the challenges of being a human, the things that can bring us back to connection with each other are the humanities, their stories, their poetry, their songs, and film. So I wanted to share a couple of different songs with you for this week. I hope that you have the chance to listen to them and just think about what it is they're saying about the aging process. One of the most obvious things that happens as we grow, especially in middle adulthood, is that we undergo physical changes. This is when we really start to see an impact of the aging process on our bodies and in certain abilities that maybe we've taken for granted up until we start to lose those abilities. Speaking as somebody who is experiencing definitely changes in my abilities, I'll be able to give you some examples. Um, so we generally see gradual changes in our capabilities, but sometimes given a person's occupation, given a person's genetics, we can see changes that happen more quickly. Generally speaking, and a lot of this is going to be general because there's so much variation when it comes to individuals, but we tend to see a weight gain as we age. It can be decreased with activity level and proper eating habits, but for example, like I'm somebody who runs 6 days a week. I work out very religiously 6 days a week. I give myself one day off. I'm extremely careful with what I eat, although I don't, deny myself the occasional indulgence of, chocolate cake or, something like that. But even with those really strong habits, I saw my cholesterol go up and I hadn't even changed anything I'd done. I am not happy that I've gained a little bit of weight, but it's not for lack of trying, right? So this is something that just kind of happens. We have to be aware and make adjustments based more on health than on appearance sometimes. Um, you can see under weight gain, the second bullet point here says declines in strength. So we start to lose bone density as we age. We start to lose our muscle strength. And so the more that we're engaged in kind of working out in certain ways, lifting weights and making sure that our muscles are as toned as possible and can handle the challenges that we ask them to complete. They're digging into our bones, which can help with bone strength. That's the kind of thing that we need to keep in mind. We do also start to lose height, which I don't know, that might have happened for me. I'm pretty short anyway. I haven't heard of that yet from the doctor, but our physical frame does begin to settle. Our vision starts to decline around age 40. I can definitely attest to the fact that this has happened to me. And it can be kind of shocking sometimes. You can start to engage in, activities that you've been doing your whole life with no problem. Then all of a sudden you're like, whoa, why can't I see? An example for me is I love to read before I go to bed. And I've noticed over the past decade, especially, that as I'm reading, I have to be, I'm making adjustments. I'm compensating for this loss of vision, unfortunately. Hearing also declines. The higher pitches degrade first, and this tends to be more prevalent in men beginning around age 55. But also, we have to think about the physical environments to which we're exposed. For example, if you've been in the military or someone that you love has been in the military or law enforcement and you have to do training with firearms, well, that's really going to impact the hearing ability, or it can, especially if we're not wearing protective equipment. So depending on the types of activities you're involved in or the way you live your life, we can directly impact these things, sometimes for the positive, sometimes for the negative. Being aware is one of the most important things that we can do. Climacteric, for women, they cease to be able to have children. This starts at about 45 years old, and the process lasts 15 to 20 years. Not a fun process. And it says 45 on the screen, but that's kind of a moving target. Okay. It's going to depend a lot on genetics and on the places where we live and the things that we have access to, like the foods that we eat, the activity that we're involved in. But genetics really is kind of a core factor in this, like when this happens and how this happens. So perimenopause is 10 years prior to menopause when hormone levels fluctuate. So this is really before the bigger event. And then menopause is finally the production of estrogen and progesterone drops. Women may experience hot flashes, candidate unfortunately right now, headaches, dizziness, heart palpitations, joint aches, night sweats, and actually this list kind of goes on and on and on. But this is what's in most of the textbooks. Now, note that there is a variation across cultures, which is super interesting. This comes down to a couple things. First of all, genetics and the pooling of types of genetics in various communities and populations, but then also the environment in which the people live, the foods that they eat, the things that they're exposed to in the environment, and then habits as far as exercise, even if it's just walking, can make a huge difference in how these symptoms kind of manifest. So according to the data, Japanese and Chinese women report fewer symptoms than Caucasians. Black women report more hot flashes. Hispanic women report more heart palpitations. But these are just looking at trends in data. Certainly there are exceptions to this data as well. For men, this begins in their mid-50s. It's a progressive decline in testosterone and sperm. The prostate may become enlarged, and according to the data, by 40 years old in about 10% of men, and by 80 in 50% of men. Sexual problems increase with age, such as erectile dysfunction. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the commercials for medications geared toward helping with this issue. So, given all of these things that happen, we can anticipate they're going to happen, preventative health screenings are really, really important. So I have shared a link here for you to follow. I'm actually not going to pull it up because I think this may adjust as we learn more, as trends change, as the lifespan perhaps extends, as maybe there are other environmental factors and issues that come up. Like, for example, we don't know how COVID or long COVID specifically might impact these types of things. So always try to stay up to date on, with regard to these resources, because they're going to keep things more up to date than just a printout. Another thing that I think is really critical to remind ourselves about is the impact that stress can have on our minds, on our bodies, on how we're moving throughout life, and how our behavior can reflect challenges that we're experiencing internally. So I think it's always valuable to revisit stress and coping strategies. So remember that stress is the physical and emotional response to events that threaten or challenge us. So we can have acute stressors, which are sudden, one-time events, maybe like a car accident or the loss of a particular loved one. We can also have chronic stressors that extend over the long term. They're continuous types of things that we need to cope with over that long term. So we may have different strategies for coping with different types of stressors. There are some strategies that can actually handle both. For example, mindfulness. This is something that I've become more aware of over the past 10 years, probably. Mindfulness, basically just reminding ourselves to, as we can, stay in the moment rather than worrying so much about what's coming up next or ruminating on things that happened already. We try to stay in the present moment. Now, certainly we don't want to ignore what's coming up or the things that have happened. Maybe there are things we need to take responsibility for or handle. But sometimes, for example, if you're on a walk with a loved one, staying in the moment can actually be really, really helpful for us and calm ourselves down. Mindset-wise, heart rate-wise, respiration rate-wise. So Mindfulness is something that you may want to look up. It's also definitely come into focus for me because my best friend is a Buddhist and teaches meditation, particularly surrounding mindfulness. So I've become very aware of the benefits of not only meditation, but just mindfulness practices in daily life. And that's just one strategy. I'm looking forward to learning more about the various strategies that you use. One powerful strategy for me is writing. You guys know I'm a writer. I love to just turn on the music and kind of sink into a story, use my imagination. For me, that works really well. If we don't figure out ways to properly cope with stress, we can have some consequences. It can impact us biologically. Our stress hormones increase. We're talking about cortisol and adrenaline. We can have an increased blood pressure, heart rate, respiration rate, sweating, aches and pains, feelings of fatigue, and overall, these are not good things for our bodies to experience, especially at elevated levels over a long period of time. It can impact our immunity directly. It can overstimulate our immunity, and it can impact autoimmunity and exacerbate current conditions that we might have. It can impact our cognition negatively. It can make us worry. It impacts our neuronal networks that support our thinking habits. This can lead to cognitive distortions where we are distorting the reality of what's going on around us. And we can do that through the lens of worry, through the lens of doubt. So we want to be aware of the thinking patterns that we're engaged in all the time and how they impact our feelings of stress and wellness or not wellness. Over time, this can also lead to mental health problems, like actual diagnoses of mental health issues. Emotionally, it can heighten our emotions if we're stressed out. We can have more extreme reactions, which can therefore lead to exhaustion. And then if we're, not sleeping well, which this can also impact, then it's like a whole cycle. It just feeds into itself. So we really need to kind of figure out the ways that work for us to deal with stress and to cope and to have healthy communication styles with our loved ones in our life. If we don't do that over time, these things can actually lead to very scary situations that can set us up for blood clots, stroke, heart disease, autoimmunity, and susceptibility to any diseases or germs that are out there because it can impact our immunity. So let's take a look at some data. This is a little bit older of a source, and I'd be interested to see how this evolves kind of over time. So you'll see in the orange is women, in the green is men, and this is death from heart disease worldwide. Over on the left, you'll see less impact from heart disease. Over on the right, you'll see more. And I think you can make some inferences based on which countries you see where and maybe the kinds of expectations for the people living in those societies, maybe the kinds of foods that they have access to, the way that the governments possibly interact with the people. I'm not going to speculate too much there, but the norms. I think we need to pay attention to the norms expected in these different societies and how this can impact stress and therefore potentially heart disease. There is an interesting article I came across called Mind Over Cancer, which I'll make available to you. So this is just one example of, certainly cancer is a huge problem in the human species. And it's something that we're trying to understand. We definitely want to reduce the threat, but it is a complicated thing. What the current research is showing us is that the emotional responses of people with cancer can influence recovery, but doesn't necessarily impact long-term survival rates. So it can impact in the short term how a person, reacts and responds to cancer, but also probably the feelings of calm or stress, right, that's going on when the person is dealing with this significant challenge. Cancer patients who are habitually optimistic report less physical and psychological stress than those who are less optimistic. Group therapy, they found, can extend life. In one study, it showed up to 18 months and reduce anxiety and pain. And positive psychology may boost the immune system, may promote activity among killer cells that fight cancer. So these are all really exciting insights to have. Certainly, it's not a fix for cancer, but we don't really have that yet. I know in Cleveland, they're doing some really interesting studies with regard to breast cancer. So I'll be really interested to find out kind of what we learn about through these different studies and how they can positively impact people's lives and either reduce the impacts of cancer or cure it. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Cognition is another area that we notice differences in middle age. Past studies indicated a decline in intelligence, but the studies were based on cohorts. So if we're looking at people moving throughout time together, there are certain things that may be impacting them that don't have to do with genetics, that don't have to do with age necessarily, but they may have more to do with historical events or environmental things that are going on that are impacting that particular group. More recent studies reveal that this is a complicated answer, right? So the short story is we do lose some, but we also gain some. So it's a mixture of growth and decline. So we may lose information processing, reasoning, and some memory, but we gain accumulated information, skills, and strategies, particularly around the kinds of things that we've spent our lives doing. So let's say we have a doctor who spends their time studying medicine, being really involved in certain aspects of the body, involved in treating patients and surgeries, and very experientially kind of learning more about biology and how it functions. So over time, as this person, even if they retire, as long as they're still to some degree using this information, even if it's just to read or to write or to teach, they're going to retain, or the likelihood is they're going to retain this information for the long term. Now, certainly things can impact this, like diseases, dementia, but the more we use it, the information, the neuronal networks that support our understanding of something, the more likely we are to retain that information and that ability to use it over time as we age. So there is this thing called selective optimization that I've kind of been referring to already. It's when people concentrate on a particular skill you retain that power, you can actually compensate for the loss in other areas. So over time, we tend to develop expertise in certain areas, acquisition of skill or knowledge in a particular area. The processing becomes more automatic, meaning we're not actively searching for the answers in our mind because we're so accustomed to certain processes. So, I was just referring to a doctor who perhaps was involved in surgeries. Well, as we perform certain activities over time, they do become more automatic. Because of the expertise, the experience, people with more extensive experience become better problem solvers, and they can be more flexible with solutions and have insights that other people with less experience might not have. Specifically with regard to memory, in middle adulthood, sensory and short-term memory may show little decline. There's some decline in long-term memory for some people. Schemas, or kind of mental frameworks that we use to understand things and to remember things, they can become shortcuts for those in middle age, but this can also be a negative because those frameworks can become more rigid. And so, you'll often hear about people in their older age being referred to as set in their ways. Oftentimes that's what that means. These schemas have served them well throughout their lives, so they kind of stick to them, even if those schemas might be limiting. There's a lot to be said for the reference to wisdom among middle age and older age. When it comes to being an adult, we tend to use both hemispheres of the brain. Sometimes we can get a little bit more focused on one hemisphere depending on our particular area of expertise and how we've been using our minds throughout our lives. But we do integrate neuronal networks around those activities and around areas where we do have in-depth knowledge and skills. And I also just kind of want to mention, this is a research interest of mine, and it has been for a long time, the the use of storytelling to convey information, not just in a formal arena like school, but through families, in friend groups, out in society. When we tell a story, we give a context. We usually have some element of imagination or attached to characters emotionally. So there's a lot of value in storytelling. So I've actually included one link to a video about that specifically, and then a link to a video about what's called middle-aged brains are awesome, and it'll give you some evidence as to why the speaker thinks that. Another thing I'm sharing with you this week, and I think I referred to this last week as well, is Valence Harvard study. This is one of my favorite studies, and I hope you enjoy it. I can't wait to hear your thoughts about it. And also, there's a video included here where George Valent discusses his own views of this particular study.